Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here. I hope you're doing well, and if you're not, I hope you are soon. Okay, today on the Dungeon Dive, we have something a little different. We are doing the top 10 works of fantasy fiction for dungeon divers. I think it's really important to read fantasy fiction as we enjoy all kinds of fantasy games, and it can help us with our enjoyment. And so I've picked 10 of the best works of fantasy fiction to share with you today. So let's get right to it. Starting with number 10, and that is from this collection here called Swords and Sorcery, edited by L. Sprague de Camp. And this is considered one of the very first collections of sword and sorcery fiction. But the story I've selected from here is called The Citadel of Darkness by Henry Kuttner, and it was originally published in 1939. So Kuttner was probably more known for his works of science fiction and weird fiction than he was his fantasy. He did have two fantasy characters that he wrote about, though, only briefly. One was called Elac of Atlantis, and I think his stories are pretty good. And the other is featured in this story, and he is called Prince Raynor. And Kuttner only wrote two stories featuring Prince Raynor, and I wish he would have written a lot more. Raynor is joined on this adventure by his Nubian friend and right-hand man, Eblik. So this was written in a time where racial tensions were higher, 1939. But I think the relationship between Prince Raynor and Eblik is really interesting, and it feels genuine, and they feel like good friends who trust each other a lot. And so I really enjoyed that part of the story. This story has everything. The Prince Raynor and Eblik are sent on a quest by a dying man. They have to go into this evil citadel and conquer an evil wizard. There's all kinds of terrible, weird cosmic forces and cosmic horror around, and just fantastic atmosphere. It's a really good questing story that leads the heroes from one place to the next, and as they go from point A to point B, they have to overcome all kinds of challenges and then finally make it to a fortress, which is kind of like a dungeon where they have to defeat an evil wizard overlord like a final boss. Just a fantastic story. So that is Citadel of Darkness by Henry Kuttner. Okay, next up is probably the rarest and hardest to find story on this list, but I think it's so good that I encourage people to check it out. And I originally read that in this collection here, again, edited by L. Sprague de Camp, and that is Warlocks and Warriors. The paperback of this can be found for not a lot of money, and I recently purchased this volume here, which is one of my holy grail books. And this is a story called Tural, and it is written by Raul Garcia Capella. And this story is just amazing. It's possibly a work of fan fiction. Capella published stories in a Conan fanzine called Amra. And his character is a guy named Arkel of Argos. And it's kind of like a Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead situation, where his character is living in the same world as Conan, is out adventuring kind of around Conan, but Conan is never mentioned. I think he's mentioned as a couple of times as that barbarian or something like that. But the story Tural is just fantastic. Imagine a story where Conan was starring in something like The Heart of Darkness or Deliverance. And that's the kind of story this is. It's a man on a river story, a man versus nature story, where this warrior is traveling up a river, and he discovers this kind of ancient city and all of these dangers deep within the heart of the forest. It also has really strong Vietnam War vibes. I know there are some arguments for sword and sorcery being anti-political, but I completely reject those arguments. And I think the politics of the Vietnam War are very acutely focused on in Tural, and it feels like that. It especially feels like that kind of 80s cinema that was about the Vietnam War. It has that kind of vibe. But if you like Heart of Darkness, if you like Deliverance, if you like Conan and those types of adventure stories, I think you will really like Tural. It's super well written, super engaging, and very, very tense. So that was number 9, Tural, written by Raul Garcia Capella and originally published in 1965. Coming in at number 8 is a story written by one of my favorite authors of adventure fiction, and that is A. Merritt. And that is the story The People of the Pit. And that was originally published in 1918. A. Merritt is a pretty big influence on H.P. Lovecraft and a whole bunch of other authors of adventure fiction. This story is an Alaskan adventure where a group of explorers searching for one thing end up finding something else, end up finding another. The tension of the expedition oozes from the pages as this group of adventurers, they meet up with a man who was a prisoner of these people of the pit, and the man conveys to them how he escaped. And in his story, he reached this mountain that was shaped like a hand, and he descended into the depths of the earth and found this other kind of eldritch city populated by these strange light beings, and they trapped him. And I think they were probably going to do some kind of weird sacrifice on him because he was chained to an altar, but he was able to escape. The book or the story is very otherworldly. The ancient city is described in very hellish ways. And it's really a great work of early cosmic horror mixed with that kind of adventure fiction. And so you can tell that this story, A. Merritt, is mentioned in Appendix N. And you can tell that his type of adventure story was a really big influence, especially on the early days of D&D and Gary Gygax and those types of things. So coming in at number 8 is People of the Pit by A. Merritt. Okay, next up at number 7, something a bit different, but that is Who Fears the Devil by Manly Wade Wellman, originally published in 1963. Now, this Paizo edition is getting kind of expensive and hard to find. However, Valancourt just published a new version of these stories. So fantasy doesn't always mean halflings, elves, dwarves, and dragons. Sometimes fantasy is more grounded in regional folklore, tall tales, and myth. Who Fears the Devil features Manly Wade Wellman's modern-day bard, a guy called Silver John, who travels around the Appalachian Mountains like Kang from Kung Fu, helping people and ridding the area of demons and monsters. It's so good. It's so endearing. Silver John is a great character. He has his silver-strung guitar that he's able to cast spells with, and he goes up against all kinds of regional folk monsters and helps people with their dealings with strange and otherworldly things in the Appalachian Mountain region of the United States. Very well written. You can tell that there's a lot of adventure, and I think a lot of these stories probably inspired a lot of writers of modules because they are kind of written in a modular-like fashion. You have a bunch of little kind of monster of the week short stories that Silver John deals with. So that was number 7 by Manly Wade Wellman, Who Fears the Devil. Okay, coming in at number 6, we already mentioned People of the Pit by A. Merritt, and I think that was a pretty big inspiration on H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness, and that is number 6, and that was originally published in 1931. At the Mountains of Madness is a grand overland adventure and a quest for knowledge in which the group of explorers discover more than they bargained for, like the People of the Pit. And they actually end up learning about the origins of humanity and the universe, but in a maddening and insane way. It's dense and slow with a mountain load of info dump at the end, but it's totally engrossing. And I think what this shows is every moment of the adventure doesn't need to be packed with action for it to be an engaging experience for the people on that adventure. Sometimes just moving from point A to point B can be the adventure in and of itself, even though it's not overwrought with monsters to fight and traps to overcome. The adventure itself can be the adventure. The travel itself can be the adventure. And I think that's what At the Mountains of Madness depicts so very well. So that's why it is at number 6 on this list. Okay, so coming in at number 5 is from the novel Sailing on the Seas of Fate, originally published in 1976, of course, written by Michael Moorcock, featuring Elric of Melniboné. And I'm focusing on the first novella in here called Sailing to the Future. So famously, the Elric novels are actually kind of different novellas and short stories that Moorcock kind of rewrote and combined to make up a novel-length work. A short novel-length work, but you can read them separately. And Sailing to the Future is such a fantastic story. So Moorcock has this idea of this eternal champion, and a bunch of his characters in his books are avatars of this eternal champion. The eternal champion is kind of this multiverse character who takes different forms throughout different time and different space. So in this story, Elric joins forces with the other avatars of the Eternal Champion. He is himself an avatar of the Eternal Champion. And together they go questing over strange and haunting seas and land into alien territory, into the depths of a dungeon that is probably some kind of UFO or spaceship. And they end up meeting up with this alien entity. So again, this story combines elements of adventure fiction, of cosmic horror, and of fantasy fiction, and it combines them all in a way that is super entertaining, super compelling, very well written, and very strange. And so coming in at number 5 is Sailing to the Future from The Sailor on the Seas of Fate, an Elric novel written by Michael Moorcock. Coming in at number 4 is, we can't do this list without mentioning Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, of course, 2 great sword and sorcery characters written by Fritz Leiber, and the story that I am picking is from Swords Against Darkness, and that is Bazaar of the Bazaar. Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, they are kind of the most iconic sword and sorcery duo. And so much of the way that these 2 characters act influenced the way that I think a lot of players actually play games like D&D. This kind of banter, this kind of constantly nagging at each other, but also having each other's backs when the time comes. So Bazaar of the Bazaar is really cool. It also is a great depiction of an urban adventure, because not all fantasy stories take place in strange wildernesses or in underground dungeons or in temples. A lot of really good adventures happen in a city. And I don't think anybody wrote better city adventures than Fritz Leiber and those stories with Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, as they had crazy times in the city of Lankhmar. And Bazaar of the Bazaar pits Fafhrd and Grey Mouser against each other in a way, because each of them is working for their own patron demon who gives them these powers. And they are tasked with going into this bazaar, this store that is filled with magical items, otherworldly strangeness, and then they end up double-crossing each other and just having these crazy adventures in this little kind of pocket dimension store. It's a fantastic urban adventures and one of my favorites, and that's why it's at number 4. Bazaar of the Bazaar, written by Fritz Leiber, originally published in 1963. Okay, coming in at number 3 is my personal favorite works of sword and sorcery fiction, and that is the Bloodsong Trilogy, or the Hell Trilogy, originally published by the author Asa Drake, who that was a pen name. Now he publishes as C. Dean Anderson, and you can get all 3 of these in an omnibus collection on Kindle. So we have the Warrior Witch of Hell, the Death Riders of Hell, and the Werebeasts of Hell. This thing is just absolutely overflowing with great adventure. And each of the volumes is great. The third one is probably the weakest. I think the second one is maybe the best, but they're all good. They're all definitely worth reading. If you like a group of adventurers working together to overcome evil, to fight monsters, it really doesn't get any better than the Bloodsong Trilogy, especially if you like a really strong female character, which can be a little hard to find in sword and sorcery fiction, but Bloodsong and her companions are great. This reminds me a lot of Masters of the Universe, of He-Man. It's kind of silly in a way. The evildoers, the evil necromancers and the evil sorcerers and the bad guys are kind of these evil mustache twirling ne'er-do-wells. They do remind me of something like Skeletor, but the evil always messes with the wrong group of badass adventurers. These novels are pure questing adventure with strong female characters and are just really overflowing with this kind of adventurous fun that we look for in the kinds of games that we cover on the Dungeon Dive. So at number 3, we have The Warrior Witch of Hell by Asa Drake, aka C. Dean Anderson, and these were originally published in 1985. And of course, we can't talk about sword and sorcery fiction, about great fantasy fiction, without mentioning Robert E. Howard and Conan. And of course, the story that I've chosen from Conan at the number 2 spot is The Tower of the Elephant, originally written in 1933, or originally published in 1933. Kind of the prototypical D&D adventurer here. We have 2 thieves, one of them Conan. They enter a legendary tower to burgle a fabled gem. But Conan ends up discovering something a bit more cosmic, a bit more esoteric than he bargained for. This is a prototypical dungeon crawl in search of treasure. It even starts in a tavern with an overheard rumor. So you can't get any more prototypical than that. A lot of these stories do mix those elements of cosmic horror, of alien strangeness with fantasy. And I think that is one of the defining factors of sword and sorcery fiction. And that is readily apparent in Tower of the Elephant. So that's why it's number 2 on this list. And finally, at number 1, we're returning back to the beginning. We're returning back to where this list started, and that's with this collection edited by L. Sprague de Camp, and that is Swords and Sorcery. And the story I'm picking for number 1, it's my favorite fantasy story of all time, and that is The Distressing Tale of Fang Oen the Jeweler, written by Lord Dunsany and published in 1911. The Distressing Tale of Fang Oen the Jeweler feels like a fully modern, all-in-one adventure module, and it's told in only a few brief pages. It's 4.5 pages, 6 paragraphs, and it contains absolutely everything that I look for in a fantasy adventure, whether that be in a novel or a book or story form or in a tabletop game. We have Fang Oen. He's a jeweler / thief. He is given a quest to go and steal this diamond called the Dead Man's Diamond. And he needs to steal that from a spider idol statue called Hlolo that exists in this temple in the city of Mong Oling. And he goes on this overland adventure where he lathers himself in oil so he can slip from people grabbing him and trying to capture him. He goes through this strange land where these archers shoot at adventurers using only sound. And so he ties some rocks onto string and drags the rocks behind him so that the archers shoot at the rocks and not him. He basically passes a perception check to realize that these gems in this door are rigged with a trap, and so he avoids traps. He goes into the temple, gets the diamond, and then has to escape through a monster-infested cave. It has everything. And the fact that it does that in about 6 paragraphs, you can read this story in 5 or 10 minutes, and it is a complete, satisfying adventure. It's like this huge fantasy meal, shrunk down, condensed down into this little tiny bite-sized morsel. And it is a masterful work of fantasy. Fantasy fiction just doesn't get any better. And I think more than any other author, Lord Dunsany proves that you don't need 1,000 pages to tell a really good fantasy story. Sometimes you only need 6 paragraphs and 4.5 pages to tell an amazing fantasy story. And that's why The Distressing Tale of Fang Oen the Jeweler is my number 1 pick of fantasy fiction for Dungeon Divers. So, all right, guys. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. We will talk to you later. Bye-bye.